Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I've got a really interesting handheld today. This thing is called the MagicX Zero40. And as far as I can tell, this is the first mass-produced vertical handheld I have seen, so it's made for things like Nintendo DS as well as vertical arcade games. And the only real gimmick to this handheld is that they took a regular screen and then they rotated it and then built the controls around that. And so what we end up with is something that looks strikingly unique and is also surprisingly comfortable. However, you've probably already guessed that even though this thing is super cool when it comes to things like Nintendo DS and vertical games, there are a bunch of other games that are not ideal with this kind of setup. And so that's what we'll explore in this video. I want to talk about not only these systems that work really well on this device, but some others that you may want to play on a different handheld. And then of course we're going to wrap it up and figure out whether or not this thing is really worth it in the first place. And even before we get started, I did want to note that one of its main saving graces is the fact that it's fairly affordable. It's $75 here at launch. And I think that as we drill down further and further into a very niche use case, keeping it as cheap as possible is a pretty good idea. And I think that this is a pretty good match right here. Either way, grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start with the specs. So this is actually pretty much in line with a lot of other budget handhelds. The CPU is the all-winner A133P. We've seen this chipset in other budget handhelds, including the TrimUI Smart Pro and the TrimUI Brick, both are which around $50 or $60. As far as performance goes, you can expect the usual suspects, basically all the way up to PS1, a little bit of Nintendo 64, a little bit of Dreamcast, and so on. It is worth pointing out that this form factor is really focused on Nintendo DS and vertical arcade, and those two systems are going to play great on this chipset. We've got 2GB of RAM, which is going to be enough to be able to navigate through the Android 10 OS. And even though this device doesn't have any internal storage, it does have 2 microSD card slots. This means that the Android operating system is actually running off of a microSD. Now the display is a touchscreen, thankfully. That is very important when it comes to Nintendo DS. As far as size, it is 4 inches and it has a resolution of 800 by 480. That is a 5:3 aspect ratio. And 5:3 is a pretty unique aspect ratio. It's very similar to 3:2. It's a little bit taller than 16:9, but also wider than 4:3. So it's a pretty good in-between aspect ratio. The battery is 4,300 milliamp hours, and I found that in my testing it got me about 4 hours of gameplay with Nintendo DS, but upwards of 6 hours when it came to arcade games. So I'm going to say between 4 and 6 hours overall. It's also relatively lightweight. It's a little over 6 ounces or 182 grams. As far as connectivity, it does have Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but they are somewhat older and slower standards. So 2.4 gigahertz on the Wi-Fi. That's not going to be great when it comes to streaming games, for example, but when it comes to downloading stuff, like box art and whatnot, that'll be fine. And the OS here is Android 10, and they use a special launcher called Dawn, which actually works out pretty well. We'll talk about it later in the video. And then finally, it does have a couple other standards you may expect, for example, a rumble motor as well as stereo speakers. As far as pricing goes, it starts at $75 and comes in 2 colors. We have both white and black. By default, it's going to come with a 64GB card, which will be preloaded with a bunch of DS and arcade games, but if you'd like to spend a few more dollars, you can get a 128GB card, which will come with even more game options. And I think that for $75, this price is relatively competitive when you compare it to other devices with the same chipset. It's a few dollars more, but of course it's right here at launch, and so it'll probably go on sale in the future, but as it stands, I think it's pretty good that they kept it well under $100. So let's take a look at the device itself, and of note, this was sent over by MagicX for review. Like with all my videos, they are not seeing this video ahead of time, all opinions are my own, and no money was exchanged in any way. So first impressions here is that it does feel like a standard retro handheld. It's got the same kind of matte plastic that we've seen in other devices. It does feel pretty good. It's also nice and rounded along the back and front. It kind of feels like a similar angle to like the Nintendo Switch or Switch Lite, and so it actually does feel very comfortable to hold. The fact that the device is so tall vertically also gives me a lot of space for my fingers on the back, and so this has been one of the surprising things for me, is that it is a surprisingly comfortable handheld. It's also relatively thin compared to other handhelds, mostly because we have that vertically oriented screen. Now, looking at it in its entirety, this is definitely a funky design. I mean, like, these cutouts here on the bottom are very unique. It looks like something that was just kind of slapped together, but in a charming way. And I think it kind of works in the way that they've created it, that the screen is the largest part of the device here, and that everything else just kind of molds around it. I think if they had just made it a square block, it would have looked really amateurish. Now, this still does look odd as a handheld, but I think it at least shows that it has a lot of care and attention to detail in its overall design. Now, as far as the control layout, there's nothing special here. We've got our D-pad, face buttons, analog stick, start and select. We've got our shoulder and trigger buttons, and really that's about it. So very typical of a retro handheld, just in this unique shape. So let's go around and talk about these controls, starting with the D-pad. So this is a rubber membrane D-pad. No surprises here. Again, very typical of these cheaper handhelds. The pivot here is pretty good, and it is nice and snappy. And so yeah, if you're familiar with basically any retro D-pad, this is going to feel right at home. The D-pad itself is relatively small, especially given how large this device is. It's about 19 millimeters across, which is just a hair larger than on the Nintendo Switch Lite. As far as practical use, I would say this D-pad is pretty great. It is a little bit more sensitive than I would like, but only barely. When doing the contra test, if I press down and then only lightly rock it left and right, the character will barely move, but it does move. Now, when I push it all the way to one side or the other, the character starts running. But I would say in general, this is about where I want it to be, but just a little bit more sensitive. So I do think that some people will get accidental diagonals when playing certain games on this device, but otherwise I would say it is a pretty faithful D-pad. When it comes to a Street Fighter test, I would say it's a lot easier to pass this one. And so when it comes to Hadoukens and Shoryukens, no problem here whatsoever. So overall, I would say this D-pad is kind of like a B or a B plus as opposed to an A. It's a little bit more sensitive than I would like, but it gets the job done. Now, the analog stick here is excellent. This is basically the exact same that you would find on something like the Retroid Pocket devices or even the Odin 2. It is a Hall sensor stick and has a nice wide range of motion. It's pretty far inset into the device in order to make it probably more pocketable, but overall I would say it has a nice wide range of motion and feels very good. And of note, yes, it does click down for L3 and R3. And there are two things worth noting. Number one is that every emulator that I tried was automatically mapped to the D-pad. So if you're playing a game that uses D-pad controls, but you want to use the analog stick instead, it's already been set up out of the box. So this will come in great, for example, if you're playing an arcade game and you'd rather use the joystick than the D-pad. I also found that shifting my thumb from the D-pad to the analog stick is not that big of a stretch at all, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that this is a tall device, and so shifting my hand down a little bit to be able to make this a little bit more comfortable is just fine, because I have a lot to grab on here on the back either way. And then my other note about this analog stick is that it feels great. Like when actually playing a game like Super Mario 64, I can feel everything. There's no cardinal snapping. I have a whole range of motion, and I also have some pretty good dead zones here. So I'm able to, walk with Mario or run with Mario and go in any direction. It is a true analog input. In other words, I would be comfortable playing a game like Super Mario 64 on this handheld if the display itself wasn't so small when playing 4x3 content. We'll talk more about that later. Also on the left side, we've got one of our stereo speakers and then also our back and home button. So a quick press will be back and then a long press will be the home within the Android system. On the right side, we have our other speaker, then our start and select buttons. These are clicky, but not loud. I love to see that. And then we also have these face buttons. So these buttons are glossy and relatively small as well. Again, about the size of a Nintendo Switch Lite button, but they feel very good. They are a rubber membrane connection, so you can see they kind of bounce down like that. But yeah, I really like the feel of them. They are relatively small, just like the D-pad, but overall, I think they're actually pretty nice. Rounding out the control scheme, we have our shoulder and trigger buttons here up top. So a couple things about these. Number one is that they are textured, so they actually feel pretty good. There's a little bit of a texture right there, and I really like it. The shoulders and triggers are clicky, not too hard to press down on, but are silent, so I really like that as well. So they have a nice amount of padding to them here. I think they did a great job. So overall, I would say this is a rare handheld where I don't have any issues with the controls. I think that everything here is pretty good. I could nitpick things like the D-pad is a little bit too sensitive. I also think the analog stick is just a little bit too far inset, but overall, I think these are excellent controls for a $75 handheld. Almost every single one of these things at this price point have some sort of weird deal breaker, and I did not find any sort of issues with the controls on this handheld, so that's a really good sign. I also think it's a pretty good reflection of this company, MagicX. I think this is their third major handheld, and they have been very active on Discord and the other forums and whatnot, getting a lot of customer feedback and being very receptive to it as well, which is not a very common thing with some of these handheld makers. And so I am not surprised that this thing controls so well, because they have really been trying to tweak and refine them. So overall, from a controls and ergonomics perspective, I actually think this is a surprisingly good handheld. It's, got the right amount of thickness to it. It just feels pretty good in the hand. And so yeah, I think this is actually a pretty good deal. Let's talk about the rest of the I/O. So we've got two USB ports. One is for OTG, like peripherals, like a controller. And then also we have a DC or charging input. And I've tested this with a bunch of different chargers and cables, and they all work just fine. So yes, even a fast charger will work on this handheld. I also tested out the headphone jack, which gives out stereo sound and sounds nice and crisp. And then we have volume up and down. And then on the right side, we've got our two SD card slots and our power and sleep button. By default, it's going to come with a single SD card. This is the 64 gigabyte card model right here. And so this is a Kioxia card. They've said that some of them will actually be shipping with SanDisk. So it looks like they are prioritizing high quality cards as well. The second SD card can be used for expanded storage, but I found that with my 64 gigabyte card, they left about 20 gigs of extra space. And so I just put all my extra games on that. We don't have anything on the bottom, and there's not a lot going on the back here. I'm assuming they plan on putting a label here. This is an early review unit, so maybe this will look a little bit different in the future. And then this is passively cooled. So this is just basically allowing the CPU to ventilate. Now you might be wondering how large this device is compared to others. So here it is with the Anbernic RG35XXH. So this is a horizontal handheld, but you can see it has a 4:3 aspect ratio. And you can see that this one is actually a little bit wider, but of course not as tall at all. And so that's the big takeaway here, is that this thing is kind of an in-betweener between a vertical and a horizontal handheld. Here's another random handheld to give you an idea. So this is a vertical handheld, the Anbernic RG35XX Pro, with a 4:3 aspect ratio display and 3.5 inches, just like the other one we were just looking at. So you can see here that yes, a vertical handheld is going to be taller than the MagicX Zero40. Here's another comparison with yet another Anbernic device. This is the RG Cube XX. So this one has a square screen, 4 inches. And so you can see here that it's actually pretty similar in overall design, but some big differences. Number one, the Cube is a little bit wider, but then also it is not quite as tall as the one we're looking at here today. So yeah, this one is a really unique design, and there's nothing really like it. Now, given that this thing is likely going to be used mostly for playing Nintendo DS games, let's do a couple comparisons with actual DSs so you can get an idea of size as well. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the screen and compare the sizes of the screen as well. But here's a Nintendo DS Lite, which you can see is about exactly the same width, but of course a lot smaller because it's a clamshell. Here's a Nintendo DSi XL. This one is quite a bit wider, but still not quite as tall. But of course, this thing is nice and chunky too. And then finally, one other one for comparison. This is the new Nintendo DS XL. Again, a little bit wider, but not quite as tall also. This one isn't as chunky as the Nintendo DSi XL, but pretty close. So long story short, it's hard to compare sizes with something like a Nintendo DS just because these are clamshells, but this will give you an idea of how big it is altogether. Because the device is so thin, it is something that you can throw in your pocket, but it's also wide and tall. It's very blockish. And so as a result, I'm not really sure if this is something you want to keep in your pocket, but it will easily slip in and out. This might sound weird, but I think the best size comparison with this handheld is going to be a slice of bread because it's about the same size. So if you got a slice of bread at home, maybe you're making a PB&J sandwich, maybe grab it for a second and then feel it and say, would you want to play DS games on it? Because that'll give you a pretty good idea. Okay, now let's talk about the screen here. And number one is that it's a 5:3 aspect ratio, which means that it's not a 16:9 flipped over. It's actually a little bit wider. The original Nintendo DS was two 4:3 screens, one on top of another. Now, this actually has more space than needed for that, and that's why they have this border here in the center. And I think it's actually been custom made. So what we're seeing here when it comes to playing Nintendo DS content is that we are getting a full-size screen for both, and then a little bit of a border in between the two. And I think that's actually pretty good because it kind of mimics the hinge here, so it feels like a more natural layout. Now of note, because the resolution here is 800 by 480, it's not a perfect integer scale of the original Nintendo DS image. The original resolution of the DS was 256 by 192, which means a 2x integer scale would be 484, but this is only a 480 display. So what this means is that instead of a perfect 2x integer scale when you're playing these games, it's actually a 1.9x integer scale. So there is is a bit of non-integer scaling happening, but because it's so minute, it's only 8 pixels after all, you probably will not really see any pixel distortion while playing these games. So I think as far as finding a screen resolution that works well with Nintendo DS, this is actually a pretty good fit. It's not perfect, but very close. Now let's keep talking about Nintendo DS for a bit, and then we'll move on to the other systems. But next thing I want to mention is that the screen size here is relatively small. On the original Nintendo DS, they were 3-inch screens diagonally. This one here, when measuring it, is a little bit under 2.6 inches. So this screen is actually smaller than it is on the original Nintendo DS. And the screens kept getting bigger from there. So the DSi was something like 3.8 inches, and then the DSi XL was like 4.2. And so this is definitely smaller than any other DS model that was released. So for example, here is the Nintendo DS Lite, and you can see that, yeah, this one is quite a bit bigger, just eyeballing it here side by side. But there also are some other things worth noting. For example, the fact that the screen quality of this LCD panel is a lot better than the old TF screens that we had on the DS Lite. And so, colors and saturation are much better on the MagicX. And then, of course, if you look at something like a Nintendo DSi XL, it's just massive by comparison. In fact, this has become my favorite way to play DS games. It used to be the DS Lite, but then I made a video talking about how much I love that, and then people were like, no, you've got to try out the DSi XL. And ever since I picked this one up, yeah, I've been loving this one more. But of course, again, the screen quality, I think, goes to the MagicX because the saturation is much better and also the brightness is better. You can see here, this is actually at max brightness on the DSi XL. So this one is a lot better here. This one is also close to max brightness, but still a lot brighter. But if I had to choose between the two where to play my DS games, I think I would probably just rather play it on the DSi XL because we have that larger screen and it's a 1x integer scale. Everything looks perfectly balanced. And I don't know, there's just a lot of fun to come from playing the original hardware as well. Okay, and then finally we've got our Nintendo 3DS, or actually new Nintendo 2DS XL, but yeah, it's a 3DS. And the issue with that is that this higher resolution screen does not scale Nintendo DS as nicely as the actual DS devices. And then also natively there is no upscaling, so it's taking the 1x resolution image and then just blowing it up to a higher resolution than it actually is, and then that causes some fuzziness in the display and a little bit over sharpening to compensate. And so DS doesn't look really good on 3DS devices. Now on the drastic emulator they already have preloaded here on the MagicX, it is running at a 2x integer scale upscale, so it's already twice as sharp as this device, even though the screen is smaller. And it's not a perfect 2x integer scale like I mentioned before, it's a 1.9x integer scale. It's still very close, and so I would say this does look a lot better than the 3DS, just not as big. And same thing applies here as well. I think the colors are more saturated and vibrant here than on the Nintendo 2DS XL that I have. So long story short, when it comes to playing Nintendo DS, I think that the colors here are better than they are on the original consoles, but the size is going to be smaller. And the smaller size is going to come into play when you're playing certain games. For example, one of my favorite old DS games is P-Cross DS. Now, this one I used a stylus with, and I used to, just kind of tap through all the numbers and whatnot. But here, it's not the same experience because it is very hard to actually hit the blocks with your finger here. A DS stylus is not going to work. It's a different type of touchscreen technology. And so you're kind of stuck with, using your finger. You can get like little styluses that have like a little rubber nub on them. But essentially, that's what you're going to be stuck with. And it's a little bit less of a fun experience compared to actually using a stylus on a DS. So in the end, when it comes to more touch style games, those that require more precise movements, I have found that the MagicX is not ideal. One, because the screen is smaller than basically any other original DS experience, but then also your finger itself is not as precise as using a stylus. So you may have to look into third-party styluses from Amazon to get a more precise result. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I think that the overall colors and vibrance are actually pretty good. Nothing that is like OLED quality, but I think that it's well saturated when you look at it. When it comes to brightness and dimness, I would say this is a relatively dim display. I've actually been playing this at 100% brightness throughout this filming. Generally, I try to play at around 50 or 60% brightness, but this is just a little bit too dim at those lower levels. Now, in terms of the dimmest setting, you can see it does get pretty darn dim, but my concern is the fact that this doesn't get super bright, which means it may not be great for playing outdoors. So here I am playing outdoors. This is about, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so the sun is almost directly overhead. And you can see that in direct sunlight, I can still barely see the image, not super great, but this is something that I probably would not want to play outdoors altogether. Now, in terms of audio quality, I think it's relatively decent considering that this is a $75 handheld. It's got stereo sound, and I can hear all the highs and lows and mids relatively well. It's not super sharp and crisp, but I don't really have many complaints. So in general, I would say the audio here is decent and above average at this price point overall. Okay, now let's talk about vertical arcade games. Now, vertical games for the most part played in a 3:4 aspect ratio, so essentially a 4:3 but turned on its side. Now, because this is a 5:3 aspect ratio, this means that we have extra space here at the bottom, and they fill this out with a little bit of a banner here that says main. So ideally, if you wanted perfect vertical arcade gaming, you would want a 3:4 aspect ratio, but I think that 5:3 is a good middle ground because it works well with DS and also works well here, and they have this little border here at the bottom to kind of fill everything out. Now, my main takeaway from this experience is that it also feels relatively small compared to what I would like to see when playing these vertically oriented games. A lot of people will just take their regular devices and then, turn them on their side and then adjust the controls so they can play, some way different. Now, that's not an ideal way of playing either, but there are some other handhelds that might be a better overall fit if you're planning on playing vertical games and some other games as well. A good example here would be something like the Retroid Pocket Classic or the Retroid Pocket Mini version 2 screens, because they're the same screen and they are nearly a square aspect ratio. They are 31:27. This means that the overall visual image is not that far off from playing on this vertical device. This one gives me about 3.2 inches vertically when playing like this, whereas this is 3.4 inches. So it is slightly bigger on the MagicX, but not by that much. So that's another thing to think about, is whether or not you need a dedicated handheld or whether or not something else on the market might be a better fit. Now, this one is more expensive. It's like $150, but it does have an OLED display and enough power to play a lot of GameCube and PS2 games, as well as everything else leading up to it. And because we have a wider aspect ratio compared to this one, this means that we can play more systems. Things like Game Boy, Game Boy Color are a natural fit here, but even stuff like Super Nintendo, Nintendo, and GameCube, they all still look really good on this screen as well. So long story short, this is an excellent way to play vertical-oriented games, and if you really want to focus on that, then yes, I think it's a pretty good fit, but it is not that far off from other devices like the Retroid Pocket Classic, which just naturally have a taller aspect ratio as well. Now, when it comes to playing non-vertically oriented games, it can be a little bit ridiculous. For example, here I am playing NES, but with a 4:3 aspect ratio, and you can see that the image here is relatively small. In fact, the image here is about 2.6 inches in a 4:3 aspect ratio, so that is smaller than a lot of micro handhelds we have on the market today. The games themselves are perfectly playable, so if you didn't mind, getting in a little bit of 4:3 content for a device that's primarily going to be used for Nintendo DS and vertical arcade, it is nice to have an added bonus like this. And there are some workarounds. For example, here with Super Nintendo, I've changed the aspect ratio to 8:7 instead of 4:3, which makes it a taller image altogether, and it does look a lot better. And same thing when it comes to taller devices overall, things like Game Boy and Game Boy Color. These also look halfway decent as long as you don't look at this huge gap here on the bottom. Another option would be to just change the orientation of the display. So if you go down here and swipe down from the top, you have different options here. If we tap it once, it's going to go into this 90-degree angle. And so now with it rotated, 4:3 content actually looks pretty great on this display. Remember, this is a 5:3 aspect ratio, so not quite as wide as 16:9. The only thing you have to think about is how you're going to control the games, just because it's going to be a little bit awkward. After all, it's still going to have the controls like this, and so you'll have to make some adjustments within RetroArch. So the way you would do that is you go into the RetroArch quick menu, go into controls, and then under port 1 controls, you would want to adjust all of these buttons right here like I already have. So you can see here, the D-pad up is left, D-pad down is right, and then this is going to be down and this is going to be up. So it's oriented now so that all these controls are going to match this display instead. You can also adjust the buttons themselves to make it a little bit more intuitive. So here with Sega Genesis, I've set it to A, B, and C. And then after that, you'd go back to the controls menu, go into manage remap files. And within here, you want to save the remap file. You can either save it as like a game remap file, or what I did is I saved it as a content directory remap file. This means anytime I play a game from Sega Genesis, it's going to have a control scheme like this. At that point, all I have to do is just swipe down from the top menu and then rotate it like I did earlier, and this is how I can play all the games from this system. And so now this is how I can play my Sega Genesis games. It is a little bit awkward, truth be told, but the image is a lot bigger, and I would consider this to be actually playable as opposed to the other one that's only 2.6 inches. So it's really going to come down to what you can tolerate, but if you really want to play some 4x3 games, this is the way I would set it up personally, even though it is a little bit awkward to hold it like this. And of course, this is a device that is not really meant to play 4x3 content, but it is kind of nice that we can squeeze that in if we want, if we're sick of playing DS and vertical arcade games. Okay, now let's talk about the software experience, and it's actually relatively intuitive. I mentioned before that I have this 64GB card that came with the device. This has the operating system on it, and it was also preloaded with some games. Now, the only games that were on the device were Nintendo DS and vertical arcade games, but there are a lot of them. You can see there are 1,400 DS games, and there are over 500 vertical arcade games. So they give you a lot of options here right out of the box. So the way this works is you can just press the A button to navigate down through the system, and you can see that, yeah, you've got all the games here listed in alphabetical order, and they've already added box art and everything. To tab between your different systems, you just press on the shoulder buttons, and same thing with the vertical arcade games, but one thing worth noting is that they don't have the full name of the game. Instead, they have just the name of the zip file, and so this is one of those things that might be a little bit disorienting if you're not used to playing arcade ROMs. A lot of other arcade systems will give you the full name, but unfortunately with this setup here with the Dawn launcher, I've only found it to give just the zip name, and so you may have to look at the image to see what kind of game you're actually playing. Now, because there are so many games loaded up on this card, it might be really confusing, but thankfully it's actually pretty easy to set up a favorite system. So all you have to do is go into the library here, and you've got a couple options. The first thing you can do is just press this top button. That's going to add it to your favorites. From there, instead of going into the library section, go into the heart section. This is going to show all of the games that you have favorited so far. I've got 47 of them listed here. This is a lot easier to navigate through than 1,400 games in the regular library. There's also a recently played section, so you can go into here as well, and you can find all the games you've been playing lately. Now, when you're in the games list, in addition to adding your favorites, you can press the Y button. It'll bring up a bunch of settings options. So here you can set up things like, for example, a high CPU mode if you wanted to push a little bit more performance to the game. You can also change what emulator launches that game, and you can scrape box art via Wi-Fi. In addition, if you really wanted to clean it out, you could just delete the games one by one. Now, it is also possible to just add your own games on here. Like I mentioned before, this thing has 20 gigabytes of extra space on my 64 gigabyte card. Now, adding games is not as simple as just pulling out the SD card and putting it into your computer. You actually have to connect it via the OTG cable, and then connect that to your computer, and then transfer files via USB. And thankfully, on the microSD card, it's very easy. There is a ROMs folder, and within that, there's going to be a bunch of subfolders. So you just have to drag and drop your ROMs into one of those folders that corresponds to the game you're trying to play. So you can see here that I've added a bunch of systems, things like Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy Color, Genesis. That's how I got all these games added, is I just dragged and dropped my own ROM files. Now, within each of those ROM folders, there's going to be a folder named Images. You can actually just drag and drop image files as well. As long as the name is the same as the ROM file, it'll automatically show up when you add those games. Now, let's say you add a game and you don't add the image. This is where you can do that scraping. So we're going to press the Y button. We'll go down here and we'll choose the Change Game Display and then Scrape. So here what you want to do is you want to tap on the scraper button, and it'll actually scrape the game one at a time. It only takes a few seconds to actually download and install that scrape, and once it's done, you can press the B button, and if we go back, you can see that, yeah, they've now added some box art for our game, which didn't have it previously. Now, if you don't want to do it one by one, what you can do is tab with the trigger buttons instead. This will take you over to the settings options. And here we've got a few options. Number one, you can go into the Android settings, or you can update your games list. This is good if you just add some games, you want to refresh the list to be able to see the new games that you added. And also here further down, you have the ability to scrape all your games at once. And so everything that's missing box art will get scraped. Some other handy features is the fact that you can actually turn on autosave and auto load for both RetroArch as well as Jurassic drastic so you can just jump right directly into your game. And so I ended up turning that on both for RetroArch and drastic, and it's actually a pretty simple experience. So if I click on a game I've already played, it'll take me back to exactly where I was. Now, in order to exit a game, I can just tap on this G button up here. It'll take me back to the menu. Now, if I need to get into the RetroArch menu, I just need to press select and start at once. It'll bring up the quick menu. So I think that's a pretty handy solution. For DS, it's a little bit different. When you start up a game, it's actually going to jump back to where you were previously. And then when you exit out of a game, it's just going to auto save it for you. So to exit out of a game, you want to press that G button again, then go into the menu, then swipe down and then hit quit. And that's going to automatically save it when you exit out and go into the menu. So now if we go back into Contra 4, it'll go back to where we were previously. And so that's how the autosave and auto load works with Nintendo DS as well. Now, because this is Android based, you can also go into the app section here, and we have all sorts of options too. So if you want to go into each individual emulator and adjust some of these settings, you can do that as well. For example, within the drastic menu, I went into the change options, then video section, and here I changed my fast forward maximum speed from 200, which it was by default, to 400. So if I'm playing a DS game, like for example, Pokemon Pearl right here, it's going to run at normal speed as I'm playing it, which is kind of slow by today's standards. So what you can do is press R2, that's going to start up fast forward mode, and it's going to try to go at 400% speed. Now this is a more intensive Nintendo DS game, and it's also running at a 2x resolution upscale, so it can't do a full 400% speed. Instead, it's about 350%, which is still a lot faster than playing it at 100% speed. So if you are trying to like speed run a Pokemon game, this is going to be better than playing it at original speed. This is one of the advantages of playing with this device over an original DS. You also have the ability to swap these screens by pressing L2 if you would like as well. So you've got a few options here within the emulator. Now, in addition to just the emulators, we've got a bunch of other options. For example, we've got Firefox. If you want to use a web browser to download additional games, you can do that. We've got the FX file browser, but one thing worth noting, there is no Google Play Store, so you will have to sideload your own APKs. At the end of the day, I think that given that this is an Android-based system, I still think it works pretty well and it's pretty intuitive. You never really have to feel like this is an Android-based device. It really is just as simple as navigating through your systems, picking your game, and launching it from here, and everything seems to work pretty nicely. The launcher itself seems to be based off of Daijisho because it is very similar to that front-end launcher, and of course, if you wanted to, you could go into the Android settings and use something else, for example, Emulation Station Desktop Edition. They just made an announcement yesterday that they are working on 5x3 support, which means that this device in particular may be able to play ESDE very easily in the future. Regardless, I think that the OS setup that they have right here is actually pretty darn good for a $75 handheld, and it's very easy to forget that this is an Android-based system. Now let's talk about battery life. So I mentioned before in the beginning of the video, I got about 4 hours of battery life with Nintendo DS and about 6 hours with vertical arcade games. Now, standby time, like sleep time by tapping on the sleep button here and leaving it, I found that I lost about 6% battery over the period of 12 hours. So this is definitely not as good as, say, for example, an original DS, which you can kind of just turn off and leave for days. But it is something worth noting that you could put it to sleep and come back later and the battery should still be okay. The battery life is a little bit lower than I was hoping for. I was hoping maybe 6 to 8 hours instead of 4 to 6, but it's still pretty darn good for a smaller and cheaper handheld. Okay, and a quick look at the insides here. I just removed the back cover. It was 4 screws, very simple. And we've got our 2 stereo speakers. We've got our analog stick. You can see our 2 RAM pieces right here. And then also our 4300 milliamp hour battery. And then finally, this is the CPU, and you can see that it is passively cooled with a heatsink. And that's about it. Overall, I think it's a relatively clean design and pretty easy to get into, and you can also see that they had 4 different revisions of this board altogether, but really that's about it. Okay, so let's go ahead and start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the MagicX Zero40. And I think the number one thing is that it's a really unique design. People have been waiting years for somebody to make a Nintendo DS emulation handheld, and MagicX is the first one to really step up and do it. And I think in terms of design, they did a pretty good job here. I think it's relatively comfortable for being a smaller handheld, and the controls here are also good. I don't have any major complaints. I was also surprised to find how easily the software just works with the Dawn launcher. I think the addition of a touchscreen on this device in particular really does help. I like the fact that it's Android without having to do additional setup, and it's also relatively intuitive to actually use it in the first place. And I think the entire package is priced well. At $75 retail, this is a decent price for what you're getting. After all, this is a handheld that can play Nintendo DS and vertical arcade games and has enough performance to handle those systems as well. I know a lot of people are going to wish that it could also play Nintendo 3DS, but I don't think that this kind of layout is the right fit for that system. A lot of people don't realize that the Nintendo 3DS had a wider top screen that wouldn't work well with a vertical orientation screen like we got here from MagicX. So I think in terms of what they set out to do in playing Nintendo DS and vertical arcade games and the price that they're asking, this is a pretty good fit. However, it's not a perfect experience, so let's talk about some of the things I didn't like when testing it. Number one, even though it is a 4-inch display, when you're showing it vertically, I found that almost everything I played felt a little bit small. The DS experience is going to be smaller than any original Nintendo DS device, and then also vertically oriented arcade games weren't as big as I was hoping they would be. When it comes down to it, I expected to have this thing kind of be my new Nintendo DS. I wanted to play a bunch of DS games on it. It was the first time we had a DS-focused emulation handheld. But unfortunately, my takeaway from this overall experience is that I still prefer the Nintendo DS original hardware. I think that if the screen was a little bit larger and allowed me to have more precise touch inputs, it would be a much better fit. But as it stands right now, it still feels like a bit of a compromise compared to the original hardware. Now don't get me wrong, there are still some magical moments when playing DS games on this handheld, because it is a natural fit for games like Sonic Rush, where you need to see both screens at once, one on top of the other. This is a really fun experience. And there are some benefits to having an emulation handheld like this, like the ability to do fast forward and save states. Those are all nice modern conveniences. But for me personally, if I'm going to shell out money for a Nintendo DS focused emulation handheld, I want it to be a vastly superior experience than playing on original hardware. And even though I think it gets pretty close, I would say that the MagicX Zero40 is not quite there, and most of it has to do with that smaller screen. In the end, I love that this company went out on a limb and tried to make a device that appealed to a niche use case, and I think that they got very close to fulfilling that, but not quite there for me. There are probably going to be a lot of people who love this little handheld because it's so quirky and unique, and it's not a high price point, so I can see a lot of people picking it up one way or another. And there is something thrilling about a little handheld like this that has 1,400 DS games and 500 vertical arcade games, and they all play out of the box. That's a really nice fit. It's just not a perfect experience for me. So long story short, if you're asking whether or not I recommend it, I think it really comes down to what you plan on getting yourself into. If you're really just looking for a unique way to play Nintendo DS and vertical arcade games, then yeah, this absolutely does it. And for $75, it's not that hard to pick it up. I would also say it's not a great all-around handheld, just because, playing other systems is a little bit weird on a vertical orientation, but you can make it work depending on what kind of compromises you're willing to live with. In the end, I would say the perfect Nintendo DS and vertical arcade game system has not been made yet, but the MagicX Zero40 gets us a lot closer to where we need to be. And I think as a novelty, it's a lot of fun as long as you know what you're getting into before you pick it up. Hopefully this review video helped you out along the way, and as always, let me know if you have any questions down below. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.